Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje eu estou aqui com o pesquisador Kjetil Loftsgarden. Nós vamos abordar aqui um tema muito interessante também. Pela primeira vez nós vamos falar sobre a questão do comércio e da fabricação, né, das pedras de amolar na era Viking. É um assunto bastante interessante. Eu gostei muito de conhecer, inclusive, o projeto Bog Rock, que durante algumas pesquisas que eu fiz aqui, e eu consegui convidá-lo para a gente falar um pouco desse assunto e trazer essa nova perspectiva também da era Viking. Mr. Kjetil, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Again, it's a pleasure receiving you here in the channel. And for starting our conversation, I'd like to know how you start your interest for subjects related to the Viking Age, to this project, Bog Rock. How you start your interest for that?
Yeah, so I come from Telemark, which is like situated in the middle of South Norway, and I grew up in the mountains, so about 750 meters above sea level. So, and Telemark is really the heartland of iron production and whetstone production in the Viking Age. And also, of course, hunting and trapping of reindeer. So I grew up with seeing like remains of iron production sites and charcoal pits, and also the Eidsborg quarry, hunting and pitfall traps and so on. So it was something that I saw in childhood growing up, and also my father taught me quite a lot on how these sites function and work, and it was natural for me to when I started studying for archaeology, it was natural for me to look more into those sites, and so that was the starting point, and it just like grew up after that. And I wrote my master's thesis on iron production, and I have worked with iron production sites and other kinds of outfield resources after that. So in Norway we have something we call it outfield. It's in Norwegian we call it utmark, but that's the areas which is bogs and mountains and woodland and so on. So outfield is not like precisely what it is, but we call it utmark, so outfield is kind of similar.
Oh, fantastic. It's amazing to know that you have this early contact with the Viking age into your region that you live. And one of the most interesting things that I find about your work is the Bog Rock project, and this is a fantastic project. What is exactly this region and the importance for the finds about the whetstones in the Viking Age?
Yeah, so when you have iron tools, when you first start making iron tools, so in Scandinavia we start making iron tools or producing iron from like 500 before Christ. And when you have iron tools, if it's a knife or if it's an axe or a sword, you need to keep the tools sharp or the weapons sharp. And to do so, you have a whetstone or a sharpening stone. So it's like could be different kinds of stone, but you need it to be like finely grained, and so it sharpens the edge of the blade. So if you don't have whetstones or sharpening stones, the iron tools or weapons will be useless. So that's why whetstones is such a really important commodity. And in the earliest Iron Age, they use a variety of different stones to sharpen the tools. But later, and especially from the Viking Age, it's especially two quarries that produce most of the whetstones in Norway, and also for the most part of Scandinavia, at least from Norway and Denmark. And that is Mostamarka, which is situated in Trøndelag, and Eidsborg, which is in Telemark. So I have worked mostly with Eidsborg stones. So in the Mostamarka seems to be dominant in the early phase of the Viking Age, but throughout the Viking Age, Eidsborg becomes more dominant, and we see that in different marketplaces such as Ribe, where you have whetstones from Eidsborg in the earliest phase of the Viking Age, but it becomes more dominant as you go out in the Viking Age and throughout the Middle Ages. And we see whetstones from Eidsborg from places such as Wolin in Poland, or Ribe in South Denmark, Hedeby, and also in the British Isles. So they have really a vast network of stones from Eidsborg, from the quarry in Eidsborg, which have been transported throughout the waterways from the inlands of Telemark and along the coast and through the British Isles, and also to Iceland and Greenland, and probably also to Newfoundland when they were there in the early 11th century. So it's really a vast economic network we see developing from the earliest Viking Age. And but the thing is with whetstones is that they are really durable, so it's easy to find when you have excavations, and also from shipwrecks and so on. If you're lucky, we can find whetstones from shipwrecks. But that doesn't mean that whetstones were the most important product, but it is the whetstones we can find, and also whetstones are quite easily to provenance. So if you find a whetstone, or if you find a whetstone in Wolin in Poland, you can do analysis of the stone and to find out if the stone is from Eidsborg, for instance. While iron production was really an important commodity throughout the Viking Age and the Middle Ages. They are difficult to find because iron will, of course, be corrode really easily, so it's difficult to find iron tools if they have been used over time, at least outside of the burial context.
Oh, that's very interesting. So when we see this type of material, it's interesting because sometimes we think, oh, they are simple tool or simple material, but the complexity of to understand how the importance they have in this society is very, very interesting to solve that. And one of the most interesting thing is how much the whetstones was used in the society, the importance for the Viking Age. I saw that sometimes they use like a necklace in here in the use like that, and they use to sharp every time, because sometimes you have some knife that you need to use and have to sharp them. How much these objects have this so importance for the Viking?
Yeah, so we often find whetstones which are like a pendant with a hole for like a necklace, small whetstones, and they are usually, at least the theory is that they are usually used to sharpening small needles, so sewing needles. So you can use that to sharpen the iron needles, and also if you're, for instance, harvesting, like if you have a scythe or harvesting crops, you need to have the scythe always sharpened. So you need to carry your whetstone with you, so to sharpen the tools as you use it. But also it's the same with knives, or if you're using axes for chopping woods and so on. And every aspect of the Viking Age production and harvesting and agriculture, you need whetstones to keep the tools sharp. So if you want to build a Viking ship, you need to have whetstones at hand, good whetstones to keep the tools, the axes sharpened at all times. And also if you're going on Viking raids, for instance, it's the same. You need to have your tools and your weapons sharp. So it's likely that we can see like whetstones and iron tools and weapons are like comes at a package in a way. So iron and whetstones is like you need, if you have iron tools and weapons, you need whetstones. So so it was really important for all aspects of the Viking Age daily life, but also like production and trade and so on. And that's why often we find whetstones on most excavations, because they are quite durable, but also because they were so common. Everybody had whetstones. But the strange thing is that, sorry.
Oh, it's interesting because this object became, how can I say, a very useful object that they become a trade object. And this is fantastic to solve that.
Yes, and we so we find whetstones from Eidsborg all over Northern Europe in the Viking Age. So this shows that it has been a really important trading goods, like a commodity, all like from the earliest Viking Age, and especially in the later parts of the Viking Age and the early Middle Ages. But this, like the strange thing is that whetstones from Eidsborg are not that special. Like you find these kinds of rocks, you can find them almost like many other places also in Scandinavia, at least in Norway and parts of Sweden. But the whetstones from Eidsborg, when in the quarries, it came out as like long rods, so they're quite easily to extract whetstones. And it could be that they have sort of like a trademark in a way, not a trademark, but it's something that it becomes like the name of a good whetstone. So if you have a good whetstones, Eidsborg whetstone is perhaps like being equal to a good whetstones, so almost like a commercial, like an ad in a way, so like a branding thing. Could be that's why Eidsborg also becomes really popular as a whetstone, because it's not a unique stone, it's just it seems to be like dominant, at least in the later parts of the Viking Age.
Oh, that's very interesting to know that. And one of the most interesting things is why this simple object became an object of trade and so desired by in that time. How the commerce was working for this object.
What do you mean? I don't.
How the commerce working and operate using this object for trades in the Viking Age, how this was working in that
Yes.
period.
Yeah. So whetstones from Eidsborg were acquired in Eidsborg, of course, in the inner parts of Telemark. In the same area, you also have really a large-scale iron production from bog ore. And I think it's useful to look at whetstones and iron as a package in a way. So when you come to the Viking Age in Scandinavia, almost all iron production is situated in the inland areas of South Norway, from like the area around Eidsborg and all the way to Østerdalen towards Sweden. So 80 to 90% of all iron is produced in these inland areas. And in Denmark, for instance, they have no iron production of their own. So all iron in Denmark had to be imported elsewhere. So probably mostly from Norway and parts of Sweden. And I think it's useful to see whetstones and iron as a package, so you can see that iron and whetstones were transported out from Telemark, for instance, and towards the coast, and then via trading sites such as Kaupang, at least in the early and middle part of the Viking Age, and further towards Denmark, because Denmark was populous, and they had no iron production, they had no whetstone production, but they had a lot of grain production. And Norway had a lot of iron production and whetstones and hunting and trapping products, but they had no grain production, or they had grain production, but not that much. So they were probably reliant on imported grains and cereal from Denmark. So we had a trade there going with the outfield resources such as iron and whetstones coming from the inner parts of Norway towards Denmark, and you have grains and crops and perhaps also salt going the other way. And Denmark had in the Viking Age dominion over the coastal areas of eastern Norway, so in the Oslofjord area. So you have Danish kings are more or less the rulers of this area, so the area around Oslofjord and Vestfold area, where you also have Kaupan. And a part of their desire or wish to have dominion here must be seen in relation to getting a stable and good supply of iron from the inland areas, also as whetstones, and different kinds of hunting and trapping products such as skins, furs, and also antlers from reindeer to make combs and other types of artifacts.
Oh, this is very interesting. And the whetstones, we can say that they came from many parts of Europe, or they are more production in the region of Scandinavia. What you can say about this production of these whetstones?
We have at least in Scandinavia, it's mainly Eidsborg and Mostermarka, so Trøndelag and Telemark has been the main producers of whetstones. But you also have different quarries other places, which could be smaller and not that dominant. But it's difficult to find all the quarries because they are difficult to find in the landscape. They are situated in the woodland areas where you have not that much. We haven't surveyed that well, so it's difficult to find. But the main quarries are Eidsborg and Mostermarka. But you have also quarries in Sweden. You have no quarries in Denmark because they have little bedrock. And further down in Scandinavia, in Europe, I'm not sure. I don't have full overview, so I'm not sure. But at least in Northern Europe, it's Eidsborg and Mostermarka are the dominant quarries in the Viking Age, at least.
Oh, it's amazing though that. And the most interesting thing that I was reading is that have the parts of the commercial of this element, but we have the time of the domestic use of this element. And how much these have this use in the Viking Age? You can say that they are using more for using for tools that was used in war or battles, or you can say that the use of whetstones are much more common in the utensils for using for the day in the Viking Age, use for knives for cooking or something like this.
Yeah, no, it's probably they were used for both. And you have tools that could be used for production as well as battle and combats, like axes and so on. So many tools which have a steel inlay, they were really important to have whetstones to sharpen them. So iron comes, you have iron and then you have steel, but steel is iron with just a higher content of carbon. So that makes the iron more durable and less prone to be dull, but also more brittle. So you use if you are making axes, knives, and also to a certain degree swords, you have often iron sheeting and a steel inlay. So you have the edge of the tool or weapon is of steel, but the outer casing is in iron. That gives you a weapon which is really durable and not that easily becomes dull. But it's more difficult to make than if you make a tool of just iron with a low content of carbon. So if you have steel inlays, you need the sharpening. The sharpening stones will become even more important to keep the tool sharp. But mostly they are in knives, and axes are the most important. And also steels, so you don't get swords, so the edge don't get blunt that easily. Sharpening stones, such as whetstones, were important, like in every aspect of the life of the Viking Age. In production, but also in raids and so on. And it was quite easily available. So you had whetstones with you at all times. And in Viking ships, you could use whetstones as ballast stones, at least in trading ships. So we see in Klostad, which is Viking Age ship which was sunk in the early 11th century. They have whetstones as ballast stone as well. And then because to keep the weight of the Viking ship, to have it to be easier to sail with. So it seems to be it's not like a really. It's probably quite cheap to have whetstones, but it's really important also. Yeah.
Oh, and what types of minerals that are used to produce these whetstones? Is just an iron, or have others types of materials that are used principally to produce them?
Yeah, do you mean the stone, like the geology of the stone?
Yeah, like the whetstones, they use what type of have a specific type of mineral or
Yeah,
material that or they are made.
they use in the earliest Iron Age they often use sandstones. But the iceberg stone and also the Mostamark stone, I think, is schist. So a fine gray schist is the iceberg stone. So that seems to be really good for to be used as a sharpening stone.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I saw that have a picture that have in the page of Edisburgh project that have it's like how can I say, a pile of many uh, I think whetstones that they are there. And um this is all stones that are in a natural process, or they are it's a thing that they people probably in that time put them there. What is exactly this how can I
Yeah,
say, yeah, this place is different when saw the picture.
yeah. So if you see pictures or if you are visiting Eidsborg or other types of quarries, you see tons and tons of whetstones just lying around at the quarry. And that is stones that were judged not good enough quality. So when they took out stones, the stones were they come in almost like rods, so really long rods, like 2-3 meters long, and with about like 5 by 5 centimeters in width, more or less, and then you could chop that up into the length you wanted it. So it could be half a meter or 30 centimeters or 20 centimeters or whatever, and then you had to check the quality of the stone. So it could be that you needed to have it quite smooth, and the grains needed to be fine, and you couldn't have any imperfections in the stone, because then you couldn't sell the stone. So they checked each stone, or like a raw stone, and checked if it was fine, if it was good enough. If it wasn't good enough, they just tossed it away in the pile. They call it usselhaug. So this is like the meager pile, the pile with stones that weren't good enough. So they only sent stones that were of the highest quality to be traded and to become a commodity. But then you needed, so you took out the stone, and if it was deemed to have a high enough quality, it was taken further to be traded. But also, before you could use it as a whetstone, you need to grind it down. So they usually did that with, they could sell it ungrinded, or they could sell it as grinded, as a finished product. So if it was ungrinded, then you needed to grind it at yourself when you bought stone, and that means you used usually sand and water, and just to grind it down to give a really nice smooth surface, and then you could sharpen your tools with it.
Oh, fantastic. And what is interesting for they to have a very good whetstone? How they know this is a good whetstone and this is not okay to use? And what place is more common? They say, "Oh, this place is fantastic to us to have whetstones from that region."
Yeah, so we don't know how they did it in the Viking Age, but we do know that how they did it in more historical eras. So Eidsborg has been a place for quarrying whetstones from the early 9th century until 1950s. So continuously, more or less continuously in use. So we know from historical sources how they did it then, and we can assume that it was the same in the Viking Age. So they had different persons working in different parts of the quarry. So you had some who were experts on taking out the larger rods, and you have others who were just cutting the rods into smaller pieces and then checking the quality. So it was just a visual inspection of the stone, but you can also knock on it with a hammer to have the nice sound, if it was a good sound. So it was a visual inspection and a nice sound, and it all went really quickly because they were experienced. They had done this for years and years, so they worked really quickly, and at least in historical times, and it's fairly. You can assume that it was the same in the Viking Age. So you had different experts working in different quarries, the different parts of the quarries, and then you have others who were in charge of the transport, because in Eidsborg is situated in the mountainous areas, so you need to transport the whetstones down to the lake called Bandak, and then it was shipped out of waterways towards the coast. Yeah, first in sleds pulled by a horse. And then when it got to the lake, Bandak, then it was loaded onto a boat or more barge, and then transported down the waterways. And you have several places in these waterways where you needed to change because Bandak is about 70 meters above sea level, but you want to go down to zero, of course, to the sea. And then some places had rivers and almost nearing waterfalls, so you need to unload and load onto another barge on the other way, or less further south. And you have some of these areas are really really rich Viking Age burial finds, and we assume that this is because they could control the trade in whetstones. So some places such as Kviksei have really one of the richest areas in Telemark, and this is probably due to they could control the whetstone trade and the transport of whetstones.
Oh, that's very nice to know that, because we have some in that period, some specialists that they check, this stone was good and I will produce some part of them, or have some type of specialists in that period that take care all of this activity in the Viking Age?
Yeah, so we don't know, but we can assume that it was like that. That you have some who were competent and were in charge of the production of whetstones, and you have other who have more control of the trading and the transport of the whetstones. So you have like different levels of experts, or like persons who were in charge of different aspects of the whetstone production and trade, and also going so far as to Kaupang, or later the medieval town of Skien. You had people who were like probably more like experts in whetstone trade and could like sell or whetstones along with other types of outfield production.
Oh, that's interesting, because I saw that have I think I read an article that say that every Viking owned a stone like that, and it's common to say that people in that period, every people using this as a necklace or not, is only specific activities they use this if they are, no, it's everyone using this.
So everybody used whetstone. So, but in different, of course, in different aspects of the daily life. So you could have the woman of the house who were in charge of textile production, for instance. It was really important to have like sewing needles that were sharp, so you could sew through the woolly clothes or the linen clothes, or perhaps also fur clothes, and they had small sharpening tools to keep their sewing needles sharp, and also smaller scissors, for instance, because they will become dull quite quickly. So you need the sharpening tools to keep the scissors sharp. You also need sharpening tools like whetstones to keep razor knives sharp, and going all the way to large axes made for felling trees also needed to be sharp at all times. So it was in every aspect of the daily life of the Viking Age farm. You needed whetstones. So you had a large, but also like it was quite durable, so you could use it over a long period. But at excavation, we often find whetstones that have been used over years and years, so they are really just like, you can see it been hollowed out of wear and tear over many years of use. So it was really important to have a good whetstones, but you have different kinds of whetstones for different kinds of tools. So we have smaller whetstones like pendants for your sewing needles, and of course, and perhaps also scissors, but you could have larger whetstones for sharpening, which was placed on a table or something like that, for sharpening larger object like tools and weapons, such as even larger swords. So you need to have a sharp at all times.
When have the use of these stones in some burials, they can indicate the status of people that was using. Example, we can say that these stones are more used for people that working hard in that time than compared to the some peoples of high status, or no, it's common to use for any people independent of the status in the Viking Age.
We often find whetstones at settlement sites. Almost all sites where people have lived, we find whetstones. But we also find whetstones in burial sites. So we could find whetstones in really nice, high status burials. We can find whetstones there as well. So there's not really, but the problem. almost all graves we have in Norway are almost per definition high status graves, because we have about, let's say, 10,000 graves in Norway, and about like perhaps 5, 6, 7,000 are from the Viking Age. But that is just really a small fragment of the people who lived in the Viking Age. So the vast majority, like 95%, did not receive a burial. So it was just the highest elite of the status that out of society that received a burial in the Viking Age. But still, we find whetstones in these graves, these burials as well. So it seems that a large aspect of the society were reliant on whetstones. But of course, if you are a chief, you are not using your whetstones that much, or compared to a common worker who used whetstones on a daily basis. But it could be like the whetstones were just like part of the tool, part of the equipment, what you needed. So everybody had to have whetstones.
And the using for women are, I think, that are common for specific activities. Example, women that cooking, using these stones as necklace or some type of place, or what we can say about the use for the activities for the parts of the women in the society.
Yeah, so if you have the smaller pendant type of whetstones, they were mostly used for sewing needles, I think. And you can also see a small groove in those whetstones, like traces from the sewing needles. So that was, of course, really important. But they also needed to have scissors sharpened at all times, and also razors, which of course was used by perhaps mostly men, but and also like knives for cooking, to make food preparation for slaughtering animals, to prepare meat for dinner, for cooking, and also like vegetables, every aspect of the society. So whetstones were as important for men as it were for females, just like different aspects. They used it for different types, and also you have different sizes and also grains of the whetstones. So we see as the whetstone from Mostermarka, which I talked about, are a bit finer than the Eidsborg stone. So you could be perhaps that they used Eidsborg to have like more rough surface, like really, like it's really efficient, but then it will be kind of rough. So you can use whetstones first, and then have a finer grain from the Mostermarka or other kinds of perhaps sandstone whetstones to really finish the blade, whether it's knife or something else.
For my last question about this topic, I would like to know the durability of this material was extensive, or they have a so malleable thing that you can cut them in the pieces. How much is the useful for this element? This is an easy material to work, or is hard to produce it?
Yeah, so it's quite hard. It's durable. So when you finish the whetstones to like the finished product, you need to grind it down using sand and water, and this takes really a long time. And when you first have a nice whetstone, you could use it quite a long time until you need to grind it down again. You can grind it down several times because you need a flat surface, or as flat as you can. But they were really durable, so we don't know how long, but I'm thinking years before you needed another whetstone. And whetstones were not that costly. we think, because we see quite a lot of it on settlement sites and so on. So it seems not to have been like really difficult to get another whetstones, but still they used the whetstone until it was really, you couldn't use it anymore. It was just a thin slice of the whetstone left. So yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Mr. Kjetil, I have to like to thank you so much for being here doing this interview. I was imagine person know a lot about the Weststones, because I want to people that come to the channel and came here to explain about this project and about the Weststones, and for me was a fantastic interview. Thank you so much. Do you have some tips about books that you wanted to recommend for people that wanted to research about this topic?
The problem is that most of the literature is, I'm sorry to say, on Norwegian, like in Scandinavian languages. But you have the Ribe excavation report, or a book which has come out quite recently, which really is a good introduction to a trading site which relied much on whetstones, and also have several research papers by Irene Baug and Dagfinn Skræ, among others, who have written and researched quite a lot on whetstones, which is really interesting. And also, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to the channel. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I will just stop the recording.